Today we are in Luke chapter 19, and we're looking at the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And Marjorie, this is a rich passage. Can you give us the context for this passage in Luke's gospel?
Yes, absolutely. The first thing that I think we just realize is that Luke has given us an account, an eyewitness account, he says, of the life of Jesus, the events in the life of Jesus. And we are now at the end of Jesus' life. As he is entering into Jerusalem, this is the beginning of what we call the Passion Week. This is Jesus knowingly entering towards the cross. Mm-hmm. But it brings to mind how Luke framed Jesus' life, because very early on, and it's only in the Gospel of Luke, we heard about Jesus, the boy, age 12, also going into the temple in Jerusalem. His parents had been there with him, and they had left with their family. And Jesus actually had remained unknown to them in the temple, talking with the temple teachers. And a day or two later, Mary and Joseph realized that Jesus wasn't with them. Of course, they were panicked. They go back. They find him in the temple, and he says, well, of course, wouldn't I have been about my Father's business? So even as a 12-year-old, Jesus had this deep inner sense of his mission, of what his life was to be about, and it was about his Father's business, which I will say is ultimately establishing God's gracious kingdom rule on the earth, in Israel on the earth. But as an aside, I love it, the 12-year-old Jesus, just like many 12-year-old boys that I know, totally forgot that he wouldn't have had to tell his parents that he wasn't with them. You know, they just sort of stayed there and didn't realize the consequences. I love that humanity of him. It later on says that then he went home with his parents and was obedient to them. But just a little more about the gracious rule of his Heavenly Father that he knew it was his mission to bring. When I hear the word rule, I often think of sort of some doctrine coming from above being forced on those below. But that, of course, is not at all the way Jesus understands his desire to demonstrate God's own heart in the world. And that is what Jesus, his gift of himself is doing, is giving us God's own heart that then would rule us from within. And we will see as he is establishing his kingship in Jerusalem, looks very different than sort of a normal king coming in and brandishing weapons.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really helpful to think about this, the gospel context, but I also know to really understand this, we have to step back even further and think about how this story fits into the larger scriptural context, because it's prophesied and spoken about. So, thinking back, stepping back and thinking about how this fits into the grand narrative, how do we read this triumphal entry into Jerusalem?
Thank you, Colin. That's a great framework to look at, because indeed we have to remember Jerusalem was the special location of where God would come to meet his beloved chosen people. God, we know from Genesis, created the whole world. But we hear through Genesis also that he made a promise to one particular man and to his family and descendants. Not that they would only be the only recipients of God's love and blessing, but that they would be, the container, the vehicle into which he would place special light and blessing and teaching, and it would shine forth and draw all the nations to God. So there were prophecies about how God would come to visit Jerusalem. And one we have in Psalm 117, which is the description of the king returning to Jerusalem riding on a donkey. And of course, that is something often when we think of Passion Week, we envision Jesus as he is now riding on this donkey. That is from Zechariah 9:9. So as Jesus is orchestrating this, is asking his disciples to go and get a donkey that he could ride it into Jerusalem, he is making this parallel between himself and his role as rightful king and the prophecy of Zechariah, just by using that donkey. And then there's another prophecy that we have. When the people greet Jesus as he's going down that hill from Bethany with the words, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," they are quoting from a psalm which is entirely about God's lordship over the whole earth. And Jesus, in these words being said about him, and Luke quoting them, is affirming that he is the Lord returning to his people. And I think one of the things, there's a Hebrew word, basically God visiting his people. And when God visits his people, it is for the purpose of restoration and peace. Just in the way that when we see Jesus with somebody who's possessed by demons or is ill, he restores them, he heals them, and then he has them depart in peace. That is God's desire for his people. And that in Jesus coming on this donkey, lowly and humble, no weapons, just Jesus, he is coming in peace for the purpose of peace. Of course, we will see that it all kind of twists. You know, we're starting out the story of his entry into Jerusalem, and we're like, oh, it's all going so well. But then we have the Pharisees saying, Jesus, tell your disciples to be quiet. And we get the sense of this dangerous opposition that is not going to lead to peace. And in fact, will be the climax then at the cross.
Well, wrapping things up, any last words you want to leave us with? Anything you want to point out for us to explore?
Yeah, there are two pieces that I find particularly encouraging. One is Luke in his gospel, unlike some of the other gospels, really stresses, yes, there is opposition to Jesus, specifically in the religious leadership, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers and the chief priests. But the portrayal of the crowd, there are many who listen to Jesus' words and receive them with joy. And I love that Luke gives us that depiction, and that maybe we can even find ourselves in the crowd with that kind of hopeful ear towards Jesus. And then the other thing that I find incredibly heartening is that as Jesus is coming down the hill from Bethphage toward Jerusalem on the donkey, there's a place where he stops and looks at Jerusalem and he weeps. And you know, if we think about God coming to Jerusalem in judgment, we don't really think of weeping. You know, how many judges have wept over their courts? Mm-hmm. But this is God's own heart displayed in Jesus' character and his own heart. And there's a beautiful chapel actually built on that hillside called Dominus Flavit, and it in Latin meaning God cried. And to think that that is the orientation of God over us when we are lost, I think, is heartening to me.
Well, a rich passage and an important event in the Gospels, and we hope you have a fruitful discussion in your small groups this week.